This will be a bilingual session, so I'll try to do my best on behalf of this obligation. First of all, thank you very much for everyone, all of the participants, all of the guests, Ladies Acts, family, friends and teachers, students. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis was a Jewish Hungarian physician in the mid-19th century. He revealed, and in fact I think he is one of the few individuals that billions of people owe their lives to, he revealed the importance of antisepsis in hospitals. And he did so by reviewing the fact that children that were infants that were born using the help of midwives suffered a much lower rate of death in birth, and their mothers as well, in the days and weeks to follow the birth. However, when the infants were, when the birth process was held by physicians and nurses, children, infants, and mothers died much more. Eventually, what he saw, and by the way, he was fired for trying to act accordingly, he revealed the importance of washing one's hands after studying corpses. He was a hero, an important hero, and he understood that midwives may also be heroes. In Rabbi Zach's drasha on Parashat Shmot, the previous parasha, he dealt with leadership by spiritual leaders that are women. He concludes, Yocheved, Miriam, Shifra, Puah, Tzipora, and Batya were leaders not because of any official position they held. In the case of Batya, she was daughter of a king. They were leaders because they had courage and conscience. They refused to be intimidated by power or defeated by circumstances. They were the real heroes of the Exodus. Their courage is still a source of inspiration today. I think that having a panel that exemplifies the leadership and power of lamdanut by women that follow the footsteps, spiritual footsteps and guidance of prominent figures such as Rabbi Sachs is a very inspiring way to honor his memory and to learn from his teachings. Professor Wagner had to cancel in the last minute, so he requests all of you to understand this, but we do have very distinguished figures here today. We have Professor Zehavit Gross and Yafit Kleimer. She is a PhD student. And I would like to invite Professor Zehavit Gross to give her paper. Professor Zehavit Gross is Dean of Education Faculty here at Bar-Ilan University. She is also the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair for Values, Education, Tolerance, and Peace in the Faculty of Education here at Bar-Ilan University, a very distinguished scholar, and you will all hear in a moment her very insightful ideas. So, Professor Gross, please.
Thank you very much. לא שומעים? עכשיו? You will hear me, don't worry. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was one of the great educators of the 21st century. Many articles have been devoted to the analysis of his philosophical and social political thought. But so far, nothing has been written about his educational teaching and educational legacy. This presentation will analyze the roots of his educational concept, which may be another layer and beacon of wisdom and knowledge to fix a broken world, which is the name of one of the most important books he wrote. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks had a deep commitment to educate and convey messages of educational value. He did not want the discourse to be sterile, but to say something and contribute in a real, concrete way to the correction of the world. His pedagogy was an activist pedagogy with a dialectic, constructivist, and deconstructivist dialectical nature. Its central content was doing justice, inclusion, equality, correcting morals, and human brotherhood. His sermons were a call to open a window to a wide world that is beyond the box and the banal categories of thinking. His basic approach was that of a universalist, transnationalist, and multidimensional character. I will demonstrate the analysis of Rabbi Sacks' educational Mishnah and pedagogy through a case study of his analysis of Parashat Va'era in Sefer Shmot, because this is the parasha we shall read on Shabbat, and I will dedicate the words of the Torah to the uplifting of his soul. The method of analysis of the text will be done through a thematic analysis according to Spradley. According to this approach, first we will look for words in the text that we will organize into categories. We will seek to create connections between the categories, and we will build a theoretical model that will allow a broad view of the units of the analysis. Rabbi Sacks devotes significant emphasis to the question of liberty and freedom, which is, in his eyes, was one of the educational cornerstones for building a better and more complete person and world. He considered man's freedom to choose as a supreme educational value, and this is reflected in the Parshat Shavua. When discussing Va'era in the chapter he calls free will, Rabbi Sacks tries to understand whether God made Paro's heart heavy or whether it was Paro who did it for his own free will. He writes the following: the question is ancient. If God hardened Paro's heart, then it was God who caused Paro to refuse to send the people of Israel, not Paro himself. If so, where is the justice? It is worth noting that the essence of the concept of justice repeats itself in his commentary of this week's Parsha, and the word justice is one of the words that appears the largest number of times in all of his religious commentary. Rabbi Sacks continues and asks, how can Paro and his people be punished for a series of decisions they didn't make freely? A condition for punishment is guilt. A condition for guilt is responsibility. A condition for responsibility is freedom. We do not blame stones for falling, nor the sun for rising. The forces of nature are not choices made out of an examination of alternatives. Only man is free. Take this freedom from him, and you have taken away his humanity. According to Rabbi Sacks, freedom is the basis of human responsibility, and human responsibility is the basis of a person's humanity. He argues that Pharaoh lost his freedom because he was addicted to his ego and the value agenda he built for himself. He explains, and I quote, "This is what the Torah means when it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. The ruler who enslaved others enslaved himself. He became a prisoner of the values he cultivated. Freedom is in its deepest sense the freedom to do what is good and right, is not given but by itself. We acquire it or lose it gradually. In the end, tyrants bring their own destruction upon themselves, while those with the strength of will, courage, and willingness to go against the current gain a glorious freedom. This is Judaism, an invitation to freedom, and the path of this is through opposing idol worship and the song of the sirens of the times. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks demanded independent critical thinking, and he placed it within a broad universal philosophical corpus of non-Jewish philosophers, psychologists, and researchers, as we will see below in the analysis of the character of power. The question of the relevance of the sources was a fundamental question in his educational thought, and he looked for sources for connection between the spiritual questions that preoccupy the citizens of the 21st century and the existential problems that are raised and discussed in the Torah and the Holy Scriptures. His return to the sacred sources was in a critical, analytical manner, daring to ask difficult questions. His sermons created a new educational language and discourse, and through them a new social cultural environment was shaped that sees the sacred sources as a source of moral, social, and emotional learning. For example, in Parashat Va'era, Rabbi Sacks puts forward an original argument in his attempt to explain the dangers inherent in the loss of a person's freedom to choose. He sees a personal psychological threat to a person's mental well-being, a social threat, as he pointed out. The moral threat is the most tragic of all. Sometimes we forget or even don't know that just like the Israelites, the Egyptians themselves also experienced slavery. He describes the enslavement of the Egyptians to build the pyramids, leading to the death of many Egyptian slaves. His description is poetic. When life becomes cheap and people are seen as a means instead of an end, when abominations are tolerated in the name of tradition and rulers enjoy absolute power, consciousness is eroded and freedom is lost because culture has created an isolated space where the cry of the oppressed is not heard. Here, he reveals his sensitivity and human responsibility towards the citizens of Egypt as well. This is an analysis that sees justice and responsibility and caring for the lives of others as a life task, regardless of race, gender, or national ethnic affiliation. It seems to me that the secret of the magic of Lord Jonathan Sacks' writings and interpretation of the Torah is that they give the reader psychological and pedagogical strength, resilience, and sense of coherence. The psychologist Aaron Antonovsky, who developed the salutogenesis approach in psychology, claimed that a sense of coherence is a personality tendency that expresses the extent to which a person has a basic and lasting confidence that what happens in his internal or external environment is predictable, understandable, and explainable. Therefore, a sense of coherence has three main competences, which are also reflected in the analysis of this week's parsha. They are comprehensibility, manageability, and meaningfulness, which I shall now analyze. Comprehensibility. The world is understandable and has a clear legality that can be understood. Rabbi Sacks reveals this through using a constructivist approach and explaining the concept in the light of the theory of legality that guides the behavior of human beings. This understanding is based on his deep knowledge of human nature and the world of psychology and social theories. In support of his argument that Pharaoh lost his freedom, Sacks cites cites a number of psychology studies, especially the work of the psychologist Stanley Milgram from Yale University, that showed how people lose their freedom and are ready to apply painful electric shocks to the horror of the person in the next room when the experimenter tells them to do so. In this discussion, he stresses the importance of value-based moral activism. Man is required to search for his humanity while exercising moral agency. In this way, he argues that the purpose of the Holy Scriptures is to produce a democratic, multicultural, humanistic civil consciousness which draws its source from the never-ending fountain of the Holy Scriptures. Manageability. A person has the ability to conduct himself in the world, and even if he encounters difficulty, he will know how to conduct himself, or alternatively, he will understand the way the world conducts itself. Here, Rabbi Sachs again uses a constructivist approach and relies on theoretical assumptions that are prevalent in his cultural and social environment regarding human behavior. He provides a cohesive, stable, and clear framework that the reader will want to adopt. But his educational thought has another layer, and it is deconstructivist, analytical layer. With this, he recognizes the fact that his interpretation is bound by the rules of discourse anchored in the cultural practices of the society in which he lives and works, but he allows himself to dare and deviate from them. Thus, he allows himself to oppose the threat that is folded into ideas that seemingly reflect a certainty that there is no end. In a deconstructivist fashion, he seeks to reject the claims based on the pretense of knowing the essence of things in order to free himself from the total commitment to them in order to correct a world that is beyond the standard and normal. The use of this method challenges the known and the common and the familiar in order to create a new consciousness highlighting complexity. Understanding God's way of leading the world is done through the exposure of the rules described by Michel Foucault as the archaeology of discourse. Michel Foucault argues that the object of the archaeological investigation is to test the function of the ideas within the discourse and to identify the mechanisms that support them. This identification of the ideas that govern the existential reality in which humans live and work then guides the practice of the discourse. In Va'era, in the chapter called Heaviness of the Power's Heart, Rabbi Sachs ponders, like other commenters, how it is possible to punish Pharaoh if God has burdened his heart and prevented him from freely choosing the good. Through his expertise in ancient Egyptian literature, he offers an original and innovative interpretation of the matter of the heavy heart, explaining this from the angle of the Egyptian ethos and ethics. The Egyptians and the pharaohs had a special attitude towards death, and they sanctified death rituals, as Rabbi Sachs explained. And I quote, "A certain aspect of the Egyptian death culture will illuminate the matter of the hardness of the heart in a new light. According to the Egyptian myth, every person is a candidate after his death for a test that checks if he is worthy to enjoy the afterlife in the field of reeds, which is also a kind of eternal paradise of pleasure for the souls. The soul, they believed, is in the heart, and therefore the gods weigh the heart. It is the only organ they keep for testing. A feather is placed on one of the scales, and the second is the heart. If the heart is light as a feather, the dead person continues to fly. Rabbi Sachs goes on to describe the procedure of weighing the heart that the dead person goes through after his death, and he goes on to write, and I quote, "The verb to weigh down had a literal meaning in the Egyptian culture. If God made Pharaoh's heart heavy, it means that the heart is lighter than a feather." Rabbi Sachs explains that the Jewish religion is a particular religion that offers universal moral messages. And I quote, "If the story of Pharaoh's heavy heart indeed alludes to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, then the entire story of Egypt is not just an internal Israeli story. It tells people that there are actions that are wrong, no matter who the doer is and who that the act is directed against him. They are also invalid according to Egyptian standards. Such is Pharaoh's decision to kill every newborn son of the Israelites." Thus, Rabbi Sachs argues that Pharaoh's decision to burden his heart is a political matter more than a psychological issue. Significance. The world is significant for man and as an integral part of his existential existence, he searches for meaning and acts in accordance with the meaning he attributes to the world in relation to his understanding of the problem and to the way God's leadership. Now, following a dialogical, dialectical, and Socratic tradition, Rabbi Sachs argues that the meaning is created by directed exposure to the ideas contained in the text, and this helps him to embody himself and his inner self. Rabbi Sachs also uses the method of social criticism to produce significance. He does not mean critical thinking whose purpose is primarily analytical, but rather examining the social implication arising from the analysis of the words of the Torah. This is not intended to be an academic analytical analysis, but to conceptualize programmatic proposals that require action and agency, namely the translation of ideas and values into program of social conduct. Rabbi Sachs focused on the civil obligations of the individual to the whole and the country in which he lives and the social responsibility implied by the words of the Torah. Rabbi Sachs rejects the theory. Rabbi Sachs, in order to understand, to explain, drawing on his extensive knowledge of theoretical literature, he notes that in modern times there are many thinkers who challenge the belief in the freedom of choice. Marx said that history is created in the play between economic forces. Freud claimed that we act on unconscious impulses. The neo-Darwinists say that even if we find a rational justification for what we do, we actually act the way we do because people who acted that way in the past survived and passed their genes on, etc., etc. Rabbi Sachs rejects the theories of these atheists and claims that our contemporaries tend to miss what the ancient sages understood, that if we do not have free will, our entire humanity crumble into dust. In conclusion, the educational message of Rabbi Sachs is the call to address the political dimension of the scriptures and to create a responsible person who is involved in the reality in which he lives. This approach is consistent with the view of most postmodern educationalists such as Peter McLaren and Paulo Freire, who claim that political education is true education, while neutral education is immoral. Neutral education is immoral. As we have seen, the main goal of the analysis of the text of the Torah of the week is to expose the binding moral dimension of the text. This is the essence of Rabbi Sachs' educational legacy. The main educational goal of the weekly Parsha lesson is to teach people to behave differently. The text of Rabbi Sachs is transformative, inspiring, and aims to bring about a change in the lives of the listeners and readers, and in the lives of society and the cultural ecology in which he lives. In this way, he creates significance and shapes through it a new consciousness that is of a binding nature for the correction of the world. The main goal in studying the text is not what can be learned about the scripture, but what the scripture seeks to create and change. That is, reading the interpretation of the text will lead to a perceptual change that will lead to a change in normative practices and their effect on the moral conduct of the person and society. The analysis of the text is a call for a paradigmatic change from the descriptive conceptual dimension to the social, moral, and normative practical dimension. Rabbi Sachs not only describes reality or explains it or expresses an opinion about it, but his interpretive text is a call for a redesign or reimagining of the social and cultural reality and the world. His interpretation of the Torah is an invitation to intervene in what is going on around us, a challenge to oppose social injustices, and an obligation to accept moral responsibility for social reality, and a war against human indifference and evil with the aim of correcting the world in the kingdom of God. Tikkun Olam B'Malchut Shaddai. Thank you very much.